the game, I'll masturbate.
Watch any interview of Scott Weiland during his final months, and you will not see the enigmatic and captivating frontman that we all came to know and love during the 90s and early 2000s.
And dance the musty.
You will see a broken, defeated, and empty version of his former self. Often seen staring into an abyss that to Scott must have seemed impossible to escape from.
More deep than space, numb.
Separated from the world surrounding him, isolated, alone, and depressed. A man about to breathe his last breath. His physical and mental struggles were on show for everyone to see, which begs the question, why did nobody help him? Why was he left to fall deeper and deeper into what must have been his own personal hell? A hell that cost him his life.
So where you going to tomorrow, and I see.
He had found monumental success with his bandmates Dean, Robert, and Eric with the release of their debut record, Core, in 1992, and would later form a supergroup with members of Guns N' Roses called Velvet Revolver. Core stirred up a great deal of controversy amongst fans and music journalists, with some saying not only did they steal their sound from Pearl Jam, but some of their songs promoted violence against women. Despite this, it would be certified gold just 6 months after its release and peak at number 3 on the Billboard charts. However, much in the same way as many bands from the 80s, STP would succumb to addiction. And as we all know, addiction went hand in hand with the rock and roll lifestyle. The only difference here was that the addiction that gripped the 90s would be far deadlier and take the lives of many icons from the 90s grunge and rock scene. Nevertheless, STP would become one of the most iconic groups of the era. This is Interstate Love, the story of Stone Temple Pilots.
This must be boring by now.
Scott Weiland was born Scott Richard Klein on October the 27th, 1967 in Santa Cruz, California. This is Scott with his father, Kent Klein, at age 5. This is also Scott with his father, Dave, at age 3. His mother, Sharon, divorced his biological father, Kent, when Scott was just 2 years old and married Dave Weiland. My new dad was a good guy whose middle name was Discipline, an aeronautics engineer with TRW Space and Electronics. He was working on advanced degrees. Shortly after he married Mum, he moved us to Chagrin Falls, a woodsy suburb outside of Cleveland, Ohio. Scott found religion at an early age, stating that he had developed a deep and abiding love of God. He became an altar boy and joined the choir. This was most likely a parental influence though, as his mother was an Episcopalian and his stepfather was a church-going Catholic. Scott would spend his childhood living between Ohio and going to see his biological father Kent in California during the summertime. Scott's time in Ohio would be spent getting up at 6 a.m., playing American football as a quarterback, wrestling, fishing, swimming practice, and homework, whereas his life in California would be quite different. Summertime in California and my dad Kent and his wife Martha. Summertime meant watching them cultivate their pot plants in the backyard, throwing their parties with Emmylou Harris and Stones records, margaritas, and shots of Cuervo Gold. This seemed to be quite a confusing time for Scott, as he very much wanted to be with his biological father, but could only see him for a few months of the year. But it seems Scott's childhood would be filled with confusing and traumatizing events. I was off to California to visit Dad and Martha's son Craig, who was my age. Craig was a great kid and one of my closest friends, but I couldn't help but be a little jealous of him. He had my dad's attention all the time. Craig had become my replacement. Then 2 years later, Craig was dead. Craig had been hit by a car whilst riding his bicycle. Although this was without doubt a difficult time for Scott, it also seems to be one of the first times he discovered the idea of processing his emotions through writing. His school teacher knew what had happened and suggested Scott try and write about how he felt. He ended up writing 10 pages about how this tragic loss had affected him. This early trauma, combined with the confusing upbringing of having more than one father and thinking one of them had abandoned you, may well have been what led to Scott escaping his reality through alcohol and substance abuse at such an early stage. His mother was also an alcoholic, and Scott had to watch her go through a 12-step program just before he became a teenager, which must have had quite an impact on him. Although Scott had already found beer in his youth, it seemed that he had also discovered hard liquor by the age of 12 in the form of Southern Comfort. He was also diagnosed with ADD, attention deficit disorder, but unfortunately, he would have to deal with something far worse than this. It was quick, not pleasant. I was too scared to tell anyone. Tell anyone, he warned, and you'll never have another friend in this school. I'll ruin your reputation. What do you do with that fear, that pain? How do memories get repressed? And where do they go to hide? Scott had been violently sexually assaulted by a male high school senior. He was becoming a young and promising quarterback, hoping to play for Notre Dame, the same as his father. However, at the age of 14, his parents informed him that they would all be moving to California on a permanent basis. This is where he started to toy with the idea of giving up football and becoming a rock star. Given his then recent history of trauma, this seemed like more of a way to escape his past, his bad memories, bury it deep, and reinvent himself and his life.
Hello, I'm Madonna. As you can see, I'm pregnant.
Future STP members Scott Weiland, Robert DeLeo, and Eric Kretz would play together in a band called Swing with 2 other musicians. After a quick lineup change, Robert brought in his brother Dean DeLeo, turning Swing into what would become the original STP lineup. Before STP, however, the band would be called Mighty Joe Young. This is them playing Club Lingerie in Hollywood, May 7th, 1990. But there are records of Mighty Joe Young playing one of their first shows a year before this. Legal issues would force a name change, and so Scott turned to a childhood comfort for inspiration. It was the summer of waiting for the muse to bless us with songs. In the center of the shrine, I placed a can of STP oil treatment. It was there for comfort. As a kid, I had STP stickers on my bike. I loved the brand. Those letters represented it all. Rebelliousness, chance victory, going for broke. I saw it as serendipitous. Although in an interview some years later, Dean DeLeo would claim that using the letters was his idea. Either way, Stone Temple Pilots was born. Yet none of the band members have ever stated how they exactly came to the name Stone Temple Pilots. One version of STP was allegedly Shirley Temple's pussy, which probably wouldn't have looked or sounded as cool. Stone Temple Pilots would land a record deal with Atlantic Records thanks to some of their early shows. These shows would include opening for the Henry Rollins Band at the Whiskey A Go-Go, supporting Body Count, an American heavy metal band formed in 1990, fronted by Ice-T, and also a small show at a venue called the Shamrock in Silver Lake. This is where STP were offered the record deal by A&R man Tom Carolyn. And it wasn't just the fact that it was a record deal that had Scott and his band members excited. Atlantic was the ideal label. It had started out as an indie and wound up signing Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, and Led Zeppelin, not to mention the Rolling Stones. We pinched ourselves, we were ecstatic. But we were also dead serious about crafting and playing the kind of self-reflective rock that we respected.
60s, late 60s, everything that was coming out that was somewhat, it was good, honest music was labeled acid rock, and that was everything from the Beatles to the Doors, and those two bands sounded nothing alike,
The Rolling Stones were hugely influential to STP, along with Led Zeppelin. Scott also became a big fan of Elton John and John Denver during his early years.
Country roads, take me home.
Dean and Robert were brothers. They grew up in a musical household with their speakers blasting Crosby, Stills and Nash, Cat Stevens, and country legend Glenn Campbell, as well as the Carpenters.
Like a rhinestone cowboy.
Drummer Eric Kretz was a huge John Bonham fan, much the same as every other single kid that grew up in the Led Zeppelin era that turned out to be a drummer. It's also worth noting that Scott also formed a post-punk outfit in high school called Soy Descent, a band that was predominantly influenced by the likes of Duran Duran, Ultravox, and The Cure. At some point towards the end of 1991, Stone Temple Pilots would channel all of these influences and more to record their debut album, Core.
This is a song called Plush. It got a lot of airplay in the beginning. I don't know, it's one of those fluke things, and at first people weren't sure how to take it, but I was, very adamant about, getting the point out what the song is about. The song is about rape. It's an anti-rape song, just taken from a different point of view to try to make a stronger point instead of coming across as I was trying to make a political statement.
1993, Stone Temple Pilots would film an acoustic episode on MTV Unplugged. The Unplugged series was arguably one of the most popular music shows of the 90s. Starting in 1989, it featured bands such as Aerosmith, The Cure, Pearl Jam, and others. But today, it's probably most famous for its iconic Nirvana episode. Nirvana would release their live show as an album several months after Kurt Cobain's death. It would be the first live album from Nirvana and debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 chart. Stone Temple Pilots would debut their single Big Empty during their MTV Unplugged set, a song that would be taken from their second studio record, Purple. STP had been catapulted into the alternative musical spotlight with the success of their debut record, Core, released September 29th, 1992. Despite eventually selling millions of copies, critics had a field day ripping this album apart. I was a serious musician looking for serious critics to take us seriously. Robert, Eric, and especially Dean, who was super serious about rock history, felt the same. So when the writers dumped on us, it was a definite drag. The music critics were completely divided. Some had nothing but praise for this incredible debut record, whilst others simply accused the band of ripping off Pearl Jam. However, there was a more sinister narrative being spun about the band. Sex Type Thing, a big hit single off the record, was characterized by some closed-minded morons as a date rape song. Some actually said that we were promoting date rape, because the song was written in the voice of the deranged character. There were critics who presumed I was that character. This seemed to be something that clearly hit Scott hard, and he wanted to set the record straight. So during several shows and TV performances, he decided to perform a drag version of the song. The drag version of Sex Type Thing became performance art. After a few bars clicked in, we saw the open-mouthed, wide-eyed looks from all the shirtless macho men in the crowd. But then, even though I'm not sure those guys got our irony, they started slam dancing, moshing, and crowd surfing. We felt justified. Our message was getting across. Amen. Not only did this show people that Stone Temple Pilots were serious about being respected as artists, it also highlighted an emotionally creative side to Scott Weiland. He wanted his art to be taken seriously, he wanted his message to be understood, but he could also be fragile and vulnerable. Interestingly, this is exactly the same type of mindset and behavior we saw with the likes of Kurt Cobain, Lane Staley, and Chris Cornell. Every single one of these musicians, all from the same musical era, had a long history of substance abuse that was closely tied into their creative process, as well as depression from early trauma. So it seemed no matter how successful Stone Temple Pilots would become, Scott Weiland was doomed from the start. Everybody has sadness in their life. Most people experiment with alcohol and marijuana. Most people don't experiment with heroin. I looked at all the great writers from the Beat generation, jazz players, they all did it, and it was starting to make its resurgence, and it all kind of ended when Kurt Cobain died. Scott Weiland. The 1990s essentially saw the rise and fall of Stone Temple Pilots. Sex Type Thing, Plush,
And I feel when the dogs begin.
Creep, Big Empty, Vaseline, and Interstate Love Song. Singles that were all taken from their first two records, Core and Purple, would be how most people remembered STP in terms of their music for the next 25 or so years to come. By the time STP had released their fifth studio album, Shangri-La Dee-Da, in June of 2001, nu metal had become the dominant genre, and people were less interested in good old rock and roll bands. And although this record still sold fairly well, it was considered to be a commercial flop. Tensions were also riding high between members of the band. I came down with a lung infection and was coughing like mad. At one point, I lost my voice. On stage, whenever my voice failed, Dean looked over as if to say, "Why are you fucking up again?" I quickly had my fill of his passive aggression. "What's the deal?" I said, confronting him backstage. "You sound like shit," he retorted. This was not the behavior of a band of brothers supporting each other through thick and thin. This seemed to be more akin to a married couple fighting with each other on the brink of a divorce. So not only was Stone Temple Pilots walking on thin ice even towards the end of the 90s, Scott Weiland had essentially been battling for his life throughout most of that decade due to his substance abuse issues. I knew I needed bodily health. I knew I needed to detox. I found a rehab place in Marina del Rey called Exodus. Just as I was about to check in, I was told not to. Kurt Cobain and Gibby Haynes were there. My business manager didn't think it was a good idea for us to be together, so I went to a treatment center in Pasadena, where 2 days later, I learned that Kurt had left Exodus. 4 days after that, I was told that Kurt was dead. Scott said that this news frightened and devastated him, yet not enough to get him clean and sober, it seems. A couple of years after this, Stone Temple Pilots were invited to support Kiss during their 1996 reunion tour. The tour was a reunion of the original members since Kiss's 1979 Dynasty tour, so it was a big opportunity for Stone Temple Pilots to reach a huge new audience. However, Stone Temple Pilots would have to pull out of the tour in order for Scott to go to rehab again. Scott's vice of choice, heroin. The same drug that had a drastic impact on the lives of Kurt Cobain and Lane Staley, amongst many others. For Scott, though, he started to resent Dean as he also had substance abuse issues, but seemingly it was only ever a problem when Scott was the one that needed the help. Scott says he was told by the rest of Stone Temple Pilots if he wanted to go to rehab, he had to pay the band money, as they wouldn't be able to tour and generate any income for themselves, whilst he was trying to save his own life. Scott Weiland became the main focus of Stone Temple Pilots, which made almost every aspect of the band revolve around him. Robert, Dean, and Eric's voices were often lost under the enigma of their lead singer. And as time went on, the narrative of what really happened to Stone Temple Pilots and Scott seemed to change. Scott became resentful of his brothers, thinking that they didn't really care about him. He felt alone and isolated, as drummer Eric recalls when speaking about their promotional tour for the third STP record, Tiny Music. I think we'd done 6 weeks. It was heartbreaking to see Scott self-destructing on that tour. When it came to touring Tiny Music, he was closing off conversations with everyone. As anybody who has family members with addiction problems knows, it's not easy. You might get a heartfelt conversation until they start getting the itch again. Then whatever was talked about just gets ignored and they're back on the train. Anyone who's ever watched a loved one suffer an addiction will be very familiar with this description Eric gives. Addicts often feel as if they have no one that cares for them. They isolate and they numb any pain they may have, physical or emotional. Dean, Robert, Eric, and Scott seem to have built up an incredibly close bond over the years, and they often just sat in a room together coming up with ideas for songs, cutting themselves off from the outside world and creating some of the most incredible music that touched a generation. However, Scott's addiction blinded him to the love his brothers had for him. But at the end of the day, from the perspective of Eric, Dean, and Robert, they simply had to watch their band fall apart, and there was nothing they could do about it. The only person that could really help Scott was himself. The first record was really a time that was amazing for us. Everything was so new, and our dreams had come to fruition. And I've just got to tell you, it was so fulfilling as a songwriter, as a bandmate, and a musician to hear what Scott would do to our songs. I miss that guy. I miss that guy that was around back then. He definitely turned into something else. I saw that there was really no coming back. The last 5 or even 7 years of his life, it was like he was never coming back. The last album Stone Temple Pilots would release with Scott Weiland would be their self-titled record from 2010. Stone Temple Pilots, as we knew them, would then cease to be on February the 27th, 2013, when Scott was fired from the band. Legal proceedings then ensued as lawsuits were filed to see who would gain control of the Stone Temple Pilots name. Scott would also lose that battle. On December the 3rd, 2015, Scott Weiland was found dead on his tour bus from an accidental overdose. A truly tragic end to a glorious chapter in music history.